Welcome to the Chronological Bible Journey, where we discover God's whole story one day at a time. I'm Tanya, and I'm here with Derek, and we will be your guides today, looking at Leviticus 20 through 22. Today's day 54. Let's begin.
Well, I'm excited. We've already addressed over the last couple of days, Leviticus can be a difficult book to read. And so I really love what one writer said. He said, Leviticus shows how God graciously provides a way for people to live in his presence. I thought that was a beautiful just example and an encouragement to us as we read Leviticus, because it seems to have a lot of just like, here's the rules, do this, don't do this, and it can just become laborsome to even read it. I can't imagine trying to keep everything in here.
Right.
And so another writer said about Leviticus 20 specifically that we see the penalty for the sins of idolatry, the penalty of involvement with the occult, the penalty for every form of sexual immorality. And then I noticed in Stan and Iva May's commentary on Leviticus 20 this morning that they said God instructed both the priests and the rest of the people regarding holy behavior. These regulations pertain to the areas of diet, sex, marriage, family relations, and offering. Now, if we're honest, if you've read Leviticus 20, there's a lot in there, and it's a little difficult, and some of it you're going, oh my goodness. And as we read that, it's easy to get bogged down there, but what I want us to understand today is that, first of all, every piece of it is important. God has given it to us, so he specifically wants us to read it, to understand it. But I don't think we have to break every single thing down in here, because not only is it in here, it's very clear. It's very specific. And so what I want us to understand in regards to the immorality portion of it is he's called us to holiness. That's what he's called us to.
Yeah.
Not just the priests, but all of Israel. And then when we obviously go to the New Testament, we see as believers, we're called to holiness as well. What's interesting, though, is when he starts out the passage in chapter 20, he starts talking about Molech, and anybody that sacrifices their children to idols needs to be put to death. It's kind of crazy that he's having to even bring these things up.
Right.
The topic of sacrificing a child. I mean, you're a mom.
As a mom,
can you even imagine?
Right. Because you want to protect your children.
Yeah.
You want to keep them safe at all costs.
Yeah, this seems kind of like a no-brainer. Like you shouldn't even have to even talk about this. And so why is he addressing this? Because the pagan people around them were doing this and they have seen this. And so God has addressed to not do it. You know, Molech worship was practiced by the Ammonites and the Canaanites. And one writer said that they revered Molech as a protecting father figure. Images of Molech were made of bronze, and their outstretched arms were heated red hot. Living children were then placed into the idol's hands and died there, or were rolled into a fire pit below.
You just can't even imagine.
I can't comprehend that. And so God's addressed to say, this is wrong. But it seems like you shouldn't even have to address that. And, you know, I've heard our pastor many times talk about this specific thing and relate it to abortion and what we see, and how for years people have gone quiet on abortion, but yet we see here God says it's wrong. And so I think it's a great reminder to us that when we look back, a lot of times we read and we say, well, those types of things aren't going on today. Those types of things are going on today. And we as believers need to stand up, and we need to look different. We need to talk different. We need to act different.
We have to be set apart.
That's exactly right. And that's the point of right here, Leviticus 20. He's telling him, you need to look different. You should look different. You are my people. And as believers, we know we are God's people as well. So why would God get so specific? Why would he have to dig down into each one of these things? And especially in regards to the immorality that he's discussing here and getting very detailed. Why does he have to address each and every one of those things? Well, I think for multiple reasons. One, they were seeing this in the pagan people that were around them. But two, they were probably seeing it somewhat among themselves as well. And so he was making sure that he was addressing each and every one of those things so that they would understand completely and there would be no question whatsoever. I mean, you would think he would just say that you need to be intimate with just your spouse, but he has detailed specifically for each and every one of those situations.
We have a tendency to do the things like the people around us are doing.
That's true.
So I think that God digs into that because he knows us. He knows our tendencies. And when we're hanging out with people who are going against his will, that's a wake-up call for us.
Absolutely.
Because we will be tempted to do the same thing, even though we know it's wrong.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great word. You know, I heard someone say one time we were discussing and in reading, this is years ago, but he said to me, he said, you know, when I read Leviticus, I think to myself, God is so strict. And so I just kind of thought about that for a while. And then I responded back to him. I said, well, if you think about the Garden of Eden, the Lord told Adam he could do whatever he wanted. There was only one thing. I was like, that's not really strict at all, but sin has messed everything up. And it has just permeated every aspect of life, and it has touched each and every area of our lives. And so I don't think God is strict at all. I think he's calling us to look differently than the world around us. Then we get into chapter 21 and 22, and it's all these instructions for the priests. And I think we could break all of those things down. He talks about that they're not to touch dead bodies. He talks about they're not to practice the same mourning rituals as the pagans. He talks about marriage for priests. He talks about how to select the priest. He talks about physical defects to look for. He talks about what they could eat and what they could not eat. I mean, very, very specific. Mm-hmm. I love this. We see a very intentional God. We see a very strategic God. We see a God of details. Mm-hmm. But I still think all of that, along paired with chapter 20, is pointing us to holiness. Ben talked about this yesterday, that God has called us to holiness. And what I would love for you to do, if you could, I want you to read what it says in Leviticus 20, verse 26.
You must be holy because I, the Lord, am holy. I have set you apart from all other people to be my very own.
I love that.
That's so special.
It is.
Yeah.
That whole saying that I'm sure you have never said as a parent, but do as I say, not as I do. God's not just telling them to live a holy life. Mm-hmm. He's saying to do this because he is holy. He has given us that example. When Jesus Christ comes to earth, he lived a perfect life. He was tempted in every way, just like we were, and yet he never failed. He never sinned. Mm-hmm. He stayed the course. And so he's calling us to something that he lives out in front of us. And then in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 9 through 12, it says, and Ben talked about this yesterday, but you are not like that, for you are a chosen people. You're a royal priest, a holy nation, God's very own possession. And he goes on to talk about, in verse 12, be careful to live properly among your unbelieving neighbors. Then even if they accuse you of doing wrong, they will see your honorable behavior and they will give honor to God when he judges the world. Mm-hmm. And I think about that, whether good or bad, there are consequences to the decisions we make, but they don't only affect us. They affect all the people around us.
Right.
And so when we live a holy life, when we live a life pleasing and acceptable in the sight of the Lord, when we pursue the things of God, not only does it affect us, it affects our spouses, it affects our children, but it affects the people around us, the people that we work with, the people that we live beside, the people that we do our hobbies alongside with. And I was talking to a guy the other day who's really big into disc golf, and he's been playing all over the city of Memphis, and he's kind of gotten into this pocket, this group of people that play all over the place. And he asked one of the guys a question the other day. He said, do you go to church anywhere? And he said, I've never been to church. And he said, well, tell me about that. Were you not raised to ever go to? He said, no. He said, honestly, I don't know that I've ever been to church before. Mm-hmm. And he said, well, have you ever thought about spiritual things or God? And he said, not really. And so they've began this relationship. And he said, Derek, he said, I went to just play disc golf, but God opened a door. And I think God opens doors all over the place.
Mm-hmm. Every day, everywhere.
Yeah. Are we living the life that God's called us to live? And then are we being intentional with the people around us? All throughout history, God has called his people to look differently, to act differently, to talk differently, and to live differently. The Israelites were given specific instructions for how they were to live, but I believe God has called us as Christians to live holy lives as well. Would you please read what Jesus says in Luke 9:23 through 25?
Then he said to the crowd, if any of you wants to be my follower, you must turn from your selfish ways, take up your cross daily, and follow me. If you try to hang on to your life, you will lose it. But if you give up your life for my sake, you will save it. And what do you benefit if you gain the whole world, but are yourself lost or destroyed? If anyone is ashamed of me and my message, the Son of Man will be ashamed of that person.
Yeah. Die to ourselves. Follow Christ. The question is, are we pursuing Christ? Are we living a life holy, pleasing, and acceptable in his sight? We can get bogged down in Leviticus, or we can use it as an encouragement that God says, be holy because I am holy.
Check yourself.
That's right.
Yeah, that's good. Well, thanks for joining us today. Thank you, Derek, for that encouraging word. I encourage you to check the show notes for encouragement, for resources to help you on your journey through the Bible.